Hello, I'm Michael Voris.
And I'm Father Pablo, Catholic missionary priest. We really want you to watch every week The One True Faith. Had you left that one true faith, please come home. We're waiting for you because we love you.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The One True Faith, the show that we say is the most disturbing hour on television because we talk about where we're going to spend eternity. This season, we're talking about the occult for 13 episodes and things occult related because various forms of occultism in all of its varied forms is making a big comeback, particularly with teenagers and young adults and particularly in the popular culture. And lots of people are unaware of the dangers that are posed by the black arts as far as the dangers to their soul, dangers to actually getting robbed and conned on all sorts of levels. So we're dedicating an entire season to this because of how important it is for people to understand that this is not just simple, innocent stuff. For followers of Christ to understand the dangers posed by the black arts, we need to understand what the world of the occult is, what's really going on there, what's there and what isn't there. So tonight we're going to be dealing specifically with the topic of psychics and psychic ability. You know, those people who can read into the future, they can look at you and read your mind, and they look all weird and mysterious, and they dress up in weird habits that look like they belong in New Orleans or something, and they have crystal balls and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, well, that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. So the first thing we're going to do, let's go back in history for a little bit, as we always do. Let's put things in perspective and look at where this all began. The word psychic comes from the Greek word for soul or mental. It usually refers to a person, someone, who has the ability to perceive information hidden from the normal senses and no one else really has access to. They have access to this because they have extrasensory perception, what we commonly refer to as ESP. Now, before we go on any further, we want to put this in context in a spiritual mode. What's being claimed on the part of someone with the power to know this hidden information is that they have some sort of mysterious force or ability or some kind of touch with the supernatural world that other people don't have. This is Gnosticism. This is all the way back to the first century where people have hidden knowledge of something, and in order to gain access to this hidden knowledge, you need to go to them. In today's modern world, of course, you go to them with a checkbook or a credit card to get this extra knowledge or this hidden knowledge. But nonetheless, this is what Gnosticism, this is rooted in Gnosticism. Actually, Gnosticism was condemned by the church as a heresy centuries and centuries and centuries ago because this claim that you have to go to certain people, like you don't have access to the divine. Well, what does that do? It destroys the whole concept of church and the sacraments and everything else. If you have to go to just certain individuals and you can't get any sort of access to the supernatural except through them, well, that destroys the whole notion of what we mean by church. So this is a very dangerous heresy, Gnosticism. The knowledge often led these people, their supposed knowledge, often led them to make these kind of outrageous claims about things. Some of them made claims which sound very similar to claims made today. People standing around saying, I have access to the future, I have access to this knowledge and that knowledge. Come to me, I'll let you know what's going on. Well, what's important to see here is how all of these different practices, fortune telling, psychic, palm reading, all this crazy stuff, all these pretended psychic abilities, how much they deflect attention away from God. This becomes a really serious topic when you look at it that way. Lots of people think, what's the big deal? You go to some psychic, you have a little palm reading, something or other going on at some carnival, what's the big deal? Well, in and of itself, it may not be a big deal, but the point is it feeds into a much larger thing that is a big deal. And lots of people put an awful lot of stock in this stuff. Some occult practices do this very directly, deflect people away from God, and they're very obvious about it. Others do it not quite so obviously at all. It seems all innocent. But in the end, the same thing is achieved. People are pursuing a certain type of knowledge that is not theirs to have. And they may be doing it as kind of a jokey thing. They may be doing it in all seriousness, but nonetheless, they're all just different branches on the same tree. These things tend to get into people's heads. I think everyone here and everybody sitting at home listening would know that they've talked to somebody at some point, a friend of theirs, who you sort of thinks like, have you lost your mind or something, says, I don't really believe this psychic stuff at all, but this one guy, I couldn't believe it. He knew everything. He may be one of the guys that's real. Everybody knows somebody like that. We've all heard that story. That's dangerous. Spiritually, that's very dangerous. This stuff gets in people's heads and it starts to mess with their intellect. That's the point. This whole psychic stuff, that's the point, is to mess with the intellect. And the intellect is not to be messed with. The intellect is one of the two spiritual faculties where we come to know God. God gave us our intellects. In the natural order, we come first to be aware of God through our senses. Our senses then process that, give that information to our intellects, which now process it and form judgments. So our senses can sit around and look at a beautiful sunrise. And while we see that and it's beautiful, now as we process that in our minds, in our intellects, we now move to the next step. Well, where did the sunrise come from? Where did all the stuff that made the sunrise beautiful? How am I able to stand here of all things? Where did I come from? How am I able to appreciate that? Those are all deep spiritual questions that begin and are born in the intellect. If the intellect becomes twisted or corrupted or unable to process things because it's got garbage in it, you distract your ability to be able to get to the object of the intellect, which is God Himself. That's why He gave us intellectual powers. This is one way we are made to the image and likeness of God, this spiritual faculty of the intellect. It's the way we, so to speak, mirror the divine. It's a touchstone to God. Jesus says, know the truth, and the truth will make you free. So while spiritual knowledge isn't just confined to the intellect, certainly there are other ways to gain spiritual knowledge, but the intellect is sort of the normal way that we go about this happening. It's how we get on and stay on the spiritual path. I mean, look, if your intellect is, sure, God could infuse every bit of knowledge, supernatural knowledge into us, skipping the intellect if He wanted to, but that's not the way He set up the world. So what do? As children, we learn to read and write. When we learn our prayers, we memorize our prayers. The intellect is very much involved in the process of us reaching out to God, learning about God, connecting to God. It isn't the end, but it's absolutely a necessary ingredient in the normative situation. So anything we do that violates the intellect diminishes and reduces our capacity for the divine. Absolutely. That is a spiritual faculty, and to reduce it or to minimize it or to corrupt it or to pervert it or to twist it lessens our ability to connect with the divine. This is why the church is so rooted in a great intellectual tradition. Read, study, write, memorize, learn all of these things. That the church is rooted in the intellectual, because it knows this is the beginning of the path to holiness. This is the beginning of the path to God. So this is the first danger in all of this loony psychic stuff, that another kind of world is presented to us which has no real touchstone to God in it. As a matter of fact, it's based on tricking your intellect. It's based on reversing it. It's not like, I believe in God and I'm going to go do this too. If you believe in God, you don't do these kinds of things. If you love God, you don't do these kinds of things. It makes us turn less to God, and who are we turning to? Man. Because that guy over there, did you hear him? He knew all kinds of stuff. Oh, that's great. Oh, it only costs $20. Oh, let's go over there. Let's turn on that TV show and listen to how she tells you what's going to happen in the future. Let's read something and find out, this is going to happen next week, or this is the kind of person I am. If you have to go to outside sources to discover who you are, something's wrong. Your intellect is diminished. You become kind of a fool, actually. So that's the whole point. It's the whole point of what it is. This is exactly how they parade themselves and present themselves to people. That's why people plop down tons of money. That's why people go to these guys, and this is how they stay in business. This has become an industry. An industry. Think about this for a second. You go to people and pay them money that you've worked hard for them to con you. And you know it. And you know it in advance. Unless you don't know it, and you really believe this person has some sort of touch to the beyond. That's terribly, terribly disturbing that people in the 21st century actually invest somebody with that kind of authority and power. And then not only do they hear something, then they react to it. They start to steer their lives according to what their psychic has told them. There's psychic hotlines, there's psychic TV shows, there's psychic publications. People read these things. They direct their lives according to these things. This is very dangerous. See, and therein lies the whole sort of philosophical danger of this, that you're trying to get access to information that you shouldn't have. When you do this, when you consult a psychic, you insult God. We're not supposed to have access to the type of information we want to have access to. For example, the future. We live in time. We live in the now. That's it. None of us has access to the future. None of us is even guaranteed there's going to be a future. No one can be guaranteed they have a next breath coming. But to try to want to skirt around the order, the temporal order, and experience our lives as though we were God, having past, present, and future immediately available to us, that's an insult to God. It's a direct slap in the face. The other problem here is that we also, when we try to attempt to gain access to this divine knowledge, and we want to know the future, that's, by the way, that's called divination, appropriately called divination. You want to be like the divine. Or you want to communicate with the dead. That's called spiritualism. Again, this isn't something we have access to. We're in the temporal world now, not in the spiritual world, and not present to it whenever we want to be present to it at whatever time. Psychic stuff is sinful. To participate in it is sinful. For a faithful Catholic to have anything to do with it is a very, very serious matter. It's an insult to God. It's sinful. In either case, whether we're talking about spiritualism or trying to read the future, divination, all of these things offend the majesty of God. These are things for the realm of the divine, not for the realm of the human. So see, when you participate in this, what are you really doing? You're pulling yourself up to the divine, or you're dragging God down to the level of human. Either case, you're putting yourself on an equal footing with God. That ought to harken back to the Garden of Eden. So, God is the master of time. We do not know the future, and we do not communicate in this sense with the dead. Only God does that. God is the Lord of the living and the dead. We don't have access to somebody when they're dead, not in the sense a psychic does or a spiritualist does, because that's not our role anymore. That person has moved on. You'll have access to them eventually, but not this way. So, this kind of dragging God down and raising ourselves up to God, this is the definition of sin. That's what sin is. There is no other definition for sin. It's presenting something that ought not to be the case. That's what sin is. And this is just a very glaring example of what it is. This is why the church has always, always instructed the faithful to have no recourse to psychics, not soothsayers, not fortune tellers, none of this business. None of this business. When you do this, you're claiming a divine power which you do not have the right to claim. It's sinful. It's sinful because it turns the person away from God. Whether the person is consciously doing that or not is beside the point. Sin has a destructive presence in the soul. That's, again, the definition, a foundational understanding of sin. It destroys the soul. When someone is in a state of sin, they drift from our blessed Lord. Even a venial sin, you drift away. The idea, what's the commandment in Matthew? Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Sin damages the relationship between each of us and our blessed Savior. That's what the sacraments exist for, in order to get us back into a state of perfect grace, us back into a state of grace with Christ so that we can continue to grow and go to where we're supposed to go to. If you think of each one of us as a glass, being filled with water is being filled with grace. We have the life of Christ in us. The Trinity is in us. When we commit some venial sin, it's like shaking the glass and some of the water flops out. Well, you know what? We are now less than what we need to be. Our capacity is greater than what the glass is currently containing. This diminishes the nature of the glass itself. What is the purpose of the glass? The purpose of the glass is to hold water. Well, if you put half the water in the glass, only half of the glass is being used. So from sort of a standpoint, some of this glass isn't being utilized, its capacity isn't being realized the way it should be. So the glass is really just sort of half a glass at this point. It's half full, but it's half a glass. This violates its purpose for being. Now, if you commit a mortal sin, dump all the water out, well, now the glass is just an empty vessel. It doesn't have anything, it doesn't do anything of the reason it was created. As a matter of fact, because it performs absolutely no function anymore for what it was created for, which is to hold water, it smashes. It smashes and it performs the same function, shattered in 100 pieces, as it does sitting there absolutely empty. It accomplishes nothing. This is the effect of sin. This is why God has given us the sacraments, to reanimate the dead. Reanimate, animus, soul, to bring the soul back to life, to bring the spiritually dead back to life, to put the broken glass, as we used our analogy, to put the broken glass back together as though it was never broken, so that it can achieve the end it was made for, which is to be full of water, to realize its full capacity. This is why we must strive to avoid sin, and seeking out psychics is just looking for sin. Participating, if any kind of psychic stuff, is just looking for sin. As we've said before, sin has an effect in this world, and it has an effect in the next. So each sin has its own peculiar effects. Seeking knowledge you have no business seeking, which is sinful, will almost guarantee you get conned by some slick-talking huckster in this life. So when we come back, we're going to take a look at the history of psychics and their secrets, of how they read your mind. We may use a couple of volunteers here from the audience to read your mind and show you how this is done. We'll be right back with the One True Faith. Hello everyone, welcome back to the One True Faith. We're talking about psychics, why it's sinful to consult them, and how they con you out of your money. And that's the next part of the show tonight here. Fortune telling or psychic abilities, this is stuff that dates back to ancient times. One popular method that we have all kinds of records of was astrology. But there were always people in the ancient world who kind of fashioned themselves as being able to have a vision of what's happening, what's the future. They could divine dreams and figure things out and all of that. In ancient times, they were called seers. Sometimes they were called prophets, but not in the way that we understand prophets in a theological sense. But in more recent times, they're called clairvoyants or psychics. Back in history, the Assyrians had men called the Nabu, which meant seers. The Egyptian priests at the temple, Ra temple in Memphis, were seers. The oracle at Delphi was overseen by a priestess that was called a Pythia. But once Christianity sort of became firmly established in the empire, all of this kind of, seers, psychic, crazy stuff went away. At least officially it went away. Perhaps the most famous centuries-old seer or psychic is a French fellow, is a French chemist who, when you Latinize his name, it's Nostradamus. He wrote a whole series of thousands and thousands of prophecies that are quite popular even to this day. You constantly see things on the History Channel about Nostradamus, or something plastered across some grocery store, newspaper headline: Nostradamus, prophecy comes true, or whatever. But scholars who've actually pored over those things using their intellects have largely dismissed the whole Nostradamus craziness for a couple of reasons. One is that because the translations of what he writes down are either badly translated, misinterpreted, or they're badly translated on purpose so that somebody can say, hey, look, I've kind of badly translated this, and this happens to hook up with World War II. There it is, look at it right there, World War II. Well, when you translate it correctly, it actually says my foot hurts. But, you get the translation a little, you change a word here or there. So the other really large reason that scholars have really dismissed Nostradamus as having any sort of real world truth is because when you look at some of the things, he wrote over 6,000 quatrains, 6,400 I think the number was, 6,000 quatrains. And when you look at them, they're so vague, and you just sort of keep reading them until you find something in history that seems to fit into them. And now you'll see all these shows on History Channel and whatever, and they'll say, oh, Nostradamus this, and he predicted that. No, was this the days of the apocalypse that Nostradamus, prophesied and blah, blah. Well, generally, they're usually hanging around with about somewhere between 10 and 20 of his quatrains. The other 6,380, which either make no sense, they don't know exactly what they're talking about, or they have no connection to anything in life, you don't really ever hear about those. So it's a pretty poor batting average on the part of Nostradamus that about 20 of his things might sort of fit like 9/11 and the World Trade Center coming down, but the other 6,500 really don't seem to have any relationship to anything. That's a pretty poor batting average. So as we get closer to the 20th century, psychic abilities seem to become more associated with spiritualism and fortune-telling, individual fortune-telling. In the old days, back in ancient times, this was always something that was associated with the state religion, and it was something to kind of direct the king or the monarch or the ruler to say, some great army is going to sweep down from the north, or that kind of thing. Today, it's just like some huckster sets up a shop somewhere, reads your palm, looks at the crystal ball, stares at you, and sort of figures out something about, you're going to marry some rich guy or, whatever. So it's really kind of turned into an individual thing now, and which is kind of a change of the last 1900 years. That's only been something that's come about in the last 100 years or so. There's this kind of whole pseudoscience that's developed around psychics. It's called parapsychology. Now, lots of people, Gallup did a poll on this back in the early 1990s on how many people believe in things like ESP. Not have you had an experience, or you think you're capable of doing this, or do you know somebody. They just said, do you believe in things like ESP and telekinesis and all that kind of stuff? And most people actually, or not most people, I'm sorry, a significant number of people actually said they believe in ESP and all of this parapsychology stuff. About 40% of Americans said they believe in that some people have psychic abilities. About 40%. That's not an insignificant number. About 2% of scientists actually happen to agree that there might be psychic ability, which, again, that's not a very good batting average. When 98% of people who study this say, this is kind of crazy, doesn't make much sense, there's no real proof for this, you can't really study this stuff. So there's this great dissonance between 40% of Americans who seem to think it's true and 98% of scientists who say this is all crazy. There's no proof to this at all. One big reason, we have to look at this and say, why would so many people believe something that just sort of cold hard science says there's absolutely no proof for this at all? Why would so many people believe this kind of stuff? Well, one reason is because the culture is kind of embedded with this. Everywhere you turn, there's fortune-telling shops, and there's this and that. It's kind of worked its way into the culture, so people just kind of anticipate that, hey, this is just sort of a natural thing, or maybe I don't necessarily believe him, but she seems to be able to read minds very well. So everywhere you look, there's books, there's TV shows, there's movies, there's some of our most popular television shows. A lot of science fiction is based on different aliens and people who have the ability to read minds and communicate with each other telepathically. There's even a primetime show on CBS right now with the main character posing to be a psychic. He's actually kind of a con artist, but he's posing to be a psychic. So this is all something that's part of our cultural experience here. If you look back in even just recent history, how many of you remember a lady by the name of Jean Dixon? Remember Jean Dixon? She was always plastered over the front of the National Enquirer just about this time of year. We're shooting this in December, where she'd always make predictions about what was going to happen, and she'd have her visions about what was going to happen in the next year. And every year, there it was, Jean Dixon's, read her prophecies, read her predictions for the coming year. I haven't seen one of those in a while, but I guess if I'd have thought about it, it would have been interesting to save up 15 or 20 years worth of those magazines and go back and see if she actually got anything right at all. And then, of course, you flip on the TV at late night and there's the Miss Cleos and there's the John Edwards crowd. John Edwards is a very interesting case because unlike some of these other people like the Miss Cleos of the world who just take people's phone-in calls, John Edwards used to demonstrate his craft in front of audiences. Now, granted, the show was taped and then edited, but he used to go put himself out in front of crowds and do this. The name of his show was Crossing Over, and he sort of hung out his shingle and presented himself as somebody who he didn't get in touch with the dead, but they just kind of would float around him and channel through him. And he never really knew how any of this worked, but that's what happened. So it's a nice place to kind of retreat to be able to say, well, I'm not the guy doing it, I'm just the tool being used. That way, if you're wrong, well, then maybe you screwed up, but you still have this ability. What he would do if you're not familiar with the show, he'd have an audience of roughly 100 people, and he'd start saying that he could communicate with the dead. He could communicate with people who were past, loved ones, and maybe somebody in the audience, he was getting some kind of vibe from the spirit world, and then he'd just start to relay things to people, and they would say, yeah, that's my Uncle Bob, or whatever, and then he would run with that and play with that. This is where we're going to have a brief discussion on pulling the wool over people's eyes. People who pretend to be clairvoyants use a number of techniques to convince you that they have this special knowledge. And this has actually been studied by scientists who sit around and look at all of this stuff, produce reports, and they get grant money to come out and figure out if clairvoyants and psychics are real or not. So they study this stuff, and there's actually a pretty significant body of research on the whole psychic phenomenon and being able to see and are you talking to people from the dead and all that. In John Edwards' case, because he stands there and does this in front of a live audience, he and many other people like him use a technique that scientists call cold reading. And what that means is simply that you're seeing somebody for the first time, you've never seen them before, so you're seeing them cold and you're taking a reading of them immediately. And you make some quick deductions based on all the things you're summing up about the person. So you look at the person for their body language, their age, their clothing, their hairstyle, their gender, their sexual orientation, their race, their religion, their level of education, their manner of speech. If you do this for a living, you're very attuned to a whole list of things you go through your mind. You look at somebody and they talk to you, they have a southern accent, and you figure, they whatever. You make some quick deductions about them. And, we do this every day in life, don't you? When you're standing in line in the store, don't you look at somebody if they're standing there and you make a quick assumption about them based on the way they dress or they look or they talk? Are they yelling at their children? Are they talking nicely to them? Have they lost their minds because they're the kids are running around going crazy and pushing the grocery cart into you? I mean, we all do this. You make deductions based on things that you look. Well, these guys do this too. They just happen to do it for a living, and they're a lot more detailed about what they're looking at. So they make a quick assessment of the person, and then they'll say some very broad statement, some very broad things that they're pretty certain will apply to this person. Once they say it and the person gives them some kind of response, some kind of reaction, they either proceed down that path with them because the person has signaled to them unknowingly that, oh yeah, or no, I don't know what that's about. So, and they proceed down the path, and every time they come to something that the person gives them some body language or nonverbal communication or sometimes a verbal communication, once they've established that link, they just keep pursuing it. And if they say something that's a little goofy or a little off, or the person kind of, I'm not so sure about that, they say, well, how about, and they just change the subject real fast. And if you watch these guys and listen to these guys, you're like, wait a second, I could do that. I could do that, couldn't I? This is what magicians essentially do too. Guys who have card tricks. They show you these things. They make you go where they want you to go. They control your intellect because you don't know exactly what's going on. They hold all the cards, so to speak. They force you, when they're doing a card trick, they force you to pick the card they want you to pick. And how do they do that? They do it based on what you say. So whatever you respond, they either go along with it or they flip it around real fast and they get you to pick the card they want you to pick. And we're going to give you an example. Does anybody want to come up and give me a volunteer? Kelly, come up here and be a volunteer. Oh, no. Oh, gosh. Oh, no. Stand right here. Okay. So let's say I'm a magician. Here's my cards, regular deck of cards, right? Yes. Okay. So now I've got 3 cards on top. We'll skip all the trick part of it and just get to where the end of the trick is. So I've got 3 cards here. See them? Ace of spades, 8 of hearts, and the 4 of clubs. Now, I am going to make him pick the ace of spades. No matter what he does or says, I'm going to force him to pick the ace of spades. There's no way he will get off this stage without picking it because that's what I want him to pick. Right? So, I mix up the cards here. Of course, I know where the ace of spades is because I'm the magician. But Kelly doesn't know where the ace of spades is. So Kelly, point to 2 cards. So he points to these 2 cards. So I'm going to get rid of this card. Now I'm going to do it again. Okay, so I'm not the greatest card magician. All right. Kelly, point to 1 card. He's pointing to this card. I'm going to get rid of this card. And what do you know? We have the ace of spades. Thank you, Kelly. Yeah, I know. Keep my day job, right? But you get the point. The simple thing here is, look, if I give him 3 cards, I know that this is the card I want him to pick. If I say pick 2 cards and he points to these 2, okay, he's gone down the path I want him to go down. If he points to these 2 cards, I simply get rid of them and I'm left with the ace of spades. If I know what I'm doing ahead of time to trick somebody, I'm going to win every time. So let's take that and apply that to psychics now. In the area of cold readers, which is the majority of times this is done, they ask you some questions and then they watch your reaction and they zoom in on the positive reactions you have, and they pass over the negative responses. Like if they need to guess what a favorite color is, for example. Remember, what are they trying to do? They're trying to convince you that they have some kind of knowledge and they're somehow connected to somebody that's dead, and that person is using them as a vehicle or an avenue to get to you. So they're trying to establish that this person here is telling them stuff that only you know this person back here knows. So they're going to pick something. Let's say it's a favorite color. So they'll say something like, I see somebody sitting in a green pasture with a blue sky. Does this remind you of somebody? Okay, now I've put you on the spot. Either it does or it doesn't. You know, the cards again. Pick 2 cards. Either pick these 2, I'm directing where you're going with this. So he says, no. Then I move on and say, well, maybe it's a sunrise, maybe it's a beach, and I just start blabbing until something with you responds. However, if I've struck gold right away, if I strike gold right away because I say, I'm seeing a green pasture, somebody sitting in a green pasture with a beautiful blue sky or something, and you go, and you're sitting there with somebody in your family, you go, well, Aunt Mabel loved green. That was her favorite color. And you go, so Aunt Mabel, I see an old house or an older house. Did Aunt Mabel live in an older house, or did she know someone that lived in an older house? Well, of course she did. She's Aunt Mabel. Of course she knows somebody who lived in an older house, and she probably was in an older house some point in her life. So the person now has given the impression, you are given the impression that Aunt Mabel back here, whose favorite color is green and used to live in an old house, has a message for you. And what's the message? I know we had that fight once, that little dust-up, but I love you and I can't wait to see you again. And of course you are reduced to tears thinking Aunt Mabel is, communicated to you from beyond the grave. And meanwhile, the huckster puts the ace of spades back in his pocket, collects your $40 and moves on. Now, how did he know how did he know that she loved green and used to live in an old house? You told him. Duh. He got it from you. So you get the idea. Another trick is called shotgunning. I'm going to tell you how I know all this stuff in a second. No, I'm not a psychic. But I am a good reader. Another technique used in addition to cold reading is called shotgunning. The psychic says some wildly generic phrase like, oh, for example, I sense an elderly man with black or dark on his lungs or his abdomen. Well, look, in a crowd of 100 people, somebody probably can relate to that. Somebody's father had lung cancer or pancreatic something or was a heavy smoker or what. Of course somebody's going to relate to a wildly generic statement like that. It's called shotgunning because you just go and you throw something out there and somebody's going to get hit by it. And then when the person gets hit by it, now that becomes your mark. And you just move on and you make up a bunch of stuff with them also. I was probably right the first time. So somebody anxious to believe that they've gotten in touch with somebody beyond the grave, that it's their dead father or their uncle or their brother or somebody. They want to believe this. So you always need a willing participant if you're the guy who's doing the reading. The psychic then does a cold reading with a whole lot of fast talk. He discovers that Uncle Fred used to drive a Corvette and he died of a heart attack. So the psychic relays a message from Uncle Fred, who used to drive a Corvette and died of a heart attack, that he loves you and he can't wait to see you. And everybody on TV's amazed and you cut to a commercial break. There's another technique fittingly called P.T. Barnum statements. Any of you know all about P.T. Barnum? He was credited as the man coming up with the expression, there's a sucker born every minute. Well, this is a perfect example. The psychic will say things. See, these are statements. And you'll say something like, I sense that you are sometimes insecure, especially with people you don't know very well. Yeah. Or, you have a box of old unsorted photographs in your house. I'm sensing that. Yeah. Everybody does. Or, you had an accident when you were a child. It had something to do with water. Well, yeah. I fell in the pool. I don't know, somebody dunked me. I got all freaked out. I fell off a cliff. I slipped in the river. Yeah. You throw these P.T. Barnum statements out there. Again, it's just bait. You throw the bait out and you reel in the sucker. That's the point. Person thinks the psychic is omniscient. How does he know we have a box of old photographs in the house? So, because the statements apply to everybody, that's the point. How do I know all this? How do people know all this? Because a former scam artist who posed as a psychic has written a great big book. He's actually written a couple of them. And his first book was called Scams from the Great Beyond. Great name. His second book, which he published a few years later, was called More Scams from the Great Beyond. And he goes through and he details how this is done. And he tells you, say this, don't say this. If they say this, you do that. And it's the whole thing. You too can become a psychic for $19.95. He goes through and details all the usual cons that they pull on people. Another one he outlines is called the rainbow. This was actually one of my favorites. The psychic suggests to you that the person has one person. Remember, these are cold readings. They don't know anything about you. They're looking at you for the first time. So they have to immediately reel you in and make you think they know you and they have some clairvoyant vision into your soul. So what do? They make you think that they know you by suggesting that you have one personality trait, but to cover their bases, they also suggest you have the opposite. So you're going to have one or the other. For example, they say, sir, I've never seen you before, but most of the time you're positive and cheerful, but there's been a time in the past when you've been very upset. And you're like, how did he know that? He didn't know. I've never seen him before. Or you're mostly shy and quiet, but when the mood strikes you, you can be the center of attention. You're like, yeah, I suppose that's true. Yeah, how does he know that? So you get the idea. This is all based in deception. It's all based on fooling your intellect. So it's psychological fast talking and psychological sleight of hand. It rests on tricking your intellect. And the sorry thing is that people submit themselves to this willingly because they want to know something they should not know. They lose their money, they lose their time, they certainly lose the respect of many people around them, and they do damage to their souls most of all. So, what's the moral of the story here before we go to a break? Catholics, don't let friends go to psychics. We'll be back right after this. Pick a card and pick a card. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The One True Faith. We're taking questions from the audience now about psychics. Hi, ma'am. What's your name? Where are you from?
My name is Mary. I'm from Detroit.
Hi, Mary.
Hi. The supermarket tabloids do still predict, still do publish the predictions from the top psychics, give their predictions for the coming year. And I'm wondering, why don't they also do a story on the hits and misses from the previous year?
Because they want to sell this year's copy. If they're, look, I mean, none of this stuff is true. If you could put 25 people together and say, give me 10 predictions about what's going to happen this year, okay, you've got a pool of 250 predictions. As long as they're reasonable predictions, something will probably come true. A very famous person is going to die. An unexpected area of the world, will erupt in war. Tell me how much money I'm going to earn in interest this year, or tell me what number is going to be the winning lotto number for Mega Millions or something. Let's put your money where your mouth is, literally. So there's no point to exposing that these guys have a horrible batting average, and if they did, nobody would buy the paper the next year. So it's interesting stuff just to see what somebody says, and that's it. And I hope most people who buy that for that reason are just saying, oh, let's see what the silliness is, and they don't actually believe it. But like we said, 40% of people, according to a Gallup poll, actually think that psychics are real and have this ability and have ESP and can predict the future. So, you certainly don't want to shatter that myth.
Of course not.
Thank you. Hi, what's your name? Where are you from?
Hello. Hi, I'm Lisa from Ferndale.
How you doing? What's your question?
I'm fine. If the souls in heaven can hear us and hear our prayers and intercede for us, then what's really so bad about going to someone who claims that they can communicate with the dead? Really, what's the difference?
The major difference is the element of grace, and that the person is the person who we pray to or pray for is the recipient of our prayers, but they don't answer us back in the fashion that the psychic presents. Like, oh, that's great. By the way, don't forget to pick up your car keys on the way out. And the problem is that when psychics present this, they don't really present the separation between life and death. It's kind of like if you can just go talk to Uncle Harry whenever you want to go talk to him, just giving, Aunt Cleo here, $50 or $100. Well, they're not really dead. It's just like Aunt Cleo's a cell phone. And you're just going back and forth through that. That's not the Catholic understanding of communicating with the dead. We don't communicate in that sense. We are in communion with the dead as part of the larger church. They pray for us, we pray to them, but the concerns of earth and the way the psychics present the topics that are being talked about really doesn't, it blends death and life as though they're the same thing, and they're not. People who die have moved on. They've been judged. They are either on their way at eternal glory, on their way there, or they're eternally damned. This theology never enters in to a psychic. I don't think I've ever seen a TV show, read a book, or anything where John Edwards, in Crossing Over, all of a sudden says, oh, your Uncle Harry seems very hot. And, he's being damned for his adultery. I mean, you never hear that. It's just Uncle Harry's up there, imagining that he wants the keys to the Corvette again and wants to go on about his life and can't wait to see you again. And it presents a false picture of the afterlife. And that's the real danger with it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, what's your name? Where are you from?
I'm Julia from Windsor.
Hi, Julia.
And my question is, what is the purpose of psychics who help police solve crimes?
This is a good question. There's one of these studies suggests that while that gets a lot of headlines and attention, it's extraordinarily rare that the psychic really contributes something more to the investigation than the police have already uncovered themselves. They might have a different way of looking at something. They might piece an information together. I guess it kind of falls into the category of, even a broken clock is right twice. But when you think about the hundreds, the thousands of unsolved murders, the missing children, the kidnapped people, the disappearances, and if psychics really had the ability that they claim in being able to do this, all of these things would be solved. Like again, I said, even different police departments and things will say, well, maybe every now and then, and it's very every now and then, very occasional, somebody might be able to, look at the piece of clothing or something and kind of deduce something from it, or just think about it in a different way. But the vast majority of times, police departments don't turn to psychics. When they do, the results of the psychics are extraordinarily hit and miss, mostly miss, and they don't necessarily solve the case. If you have this ability, then use it. If you don't, or it has to work under these certain special sorts of circumstances and everything, all the stars have to be aligned just right, well, sort of what's the purpose of the ability if you really can't use it when you need to use it? It doesn't really make sense. So but a lot of an awful lot of data shows that the things you see on TV, and the cops shows or whatever, and they say, and we called in a psychic and she took us right to the dead body that we hadn't been able to find in 500 years, it really doesn't happen the way it is presented on television.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Frank. Where are you from?
You don't know? Oh my goodness! I thought you were a psychic. Actually, you.
Wait a minute. Dearborn Heights.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. You spent most of the time talking about psychics. Would you care to comment on these assorted television preachers who claim to be able to predict the future, what's going to happen in Israel, or what's going to happen in America, or what's going to happen in the future? Comments?
They're con artists. Nobody knows the future. Only God knows the future. If God chooses to invest someone with the knowledge of the future, or being able to foresee things like some of the saints in history, well, he does that for a very specific reason. And the person, the saint who happens to have that particular gift, the gift isn't for the sake of the person. The gift, any gift given, is for the sake of the building up of the kingdom, helping somebody come to believe. And preachers standing up, blathering on about, Jerusalem's going to fall, they're going to rebuild the temple, and they're going to have this happen and have that. This is just all made up. It's all made up. Hal Lindsey he wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth, and he made all kinds of predictions about the using the book of Revelation as his sort of his source, the apocalypse. And that thing flew off the shelves. By the millions that thing sold. Go back and get a copy of it now. There's hardly a word in that book that came to pass. There's just nothing in it that was true. So again, what do you have here? You have this desire on the part of people to always want to know something they shouldn't know. It's like nosy neighbors. They always want to know something they don't want to know. You even want to know something in the future when nobody knows it except God. You're kind of being nosy in God's business. And it captures people's imagination. People want to know stuff. So when a preacher gets up or someone gets up and pretends they know this or they know that or they can read your mind or they know what's going to happen in 10 years or whatever, this grabs people who are either weak intellectually or who are emotionally driven for whatever tragic event may have happened in their life that they need to cling on to something. Those are the times this is the most dangerous. When we need to cling on to something, what we need to cling on to is God, not some huckster standing there portraying himself as having some kind of divine knowledge, because he doesn't. Nobody knows the future except God and those to whom God reveals the future, not for the sake of the person, but for the sake of those people standing around. It's that simple.
But see, the thing is, they'll always say, well, it's written in the Bible, and the Bible says, and that they know it because it's God's word, and they're doing it for their own aggrandizement rather than for doing God's work.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. Look at the $5,000 watch on their hands and the $6,000 suit they're wearing. And yeah, please, it's just that's it's not how it works. It's not how it works.
Thank you much.
All right, thanks. We'll be back in a second. We're back to this break. Welcome back to Lunch Your Faith. Just a couple of closing comments. It's Catholics have been given a gift to be able to, as St. Paul would say, to fully understand the mystery. And we really need to sort of live in that place. We have the sacraments. We have Jesus Christ personally present in the Blessed Sacrament. We have the correct interpretation of the sacred Scripture. We don't need to go someplace else to find out something we don't need to know. First of all, if we happen to have a future, if you happen to live beyond tonight, the future will come to you soon enough. You don't need to worry about what's going to happen because it's going to happen regardless of whether you know it or not. And second of all, mind your own business. What God wants us to know, we'll know. What we don't need to know, we don't need to know. And we'll find it all out when we die anyway. So we need to understand what a beautiful gift we've been given as Catholics, the faith that we've been given, this wonderful, beautiful, loving gift from the Father. When somebody you know or somebody in your family starts blathering on about psychic this or that, stand up and defend Christ to them. They're insulting God. Now, I wouldn't suggest you pick up a sword and whack them with it. But I would suggest that you understand what power and strength you have in your faith. We have the truth. We have the fullness of the truth. Use that. This is a brother or sister of yours, or whatever the relationship is, but it's a brother or sister in Christ that needs to hear the truth and be set straight. Use the sword of the Spirit and set them straight. And maybe you have to use the sword a little bit too. God love you. See you next time on The One True Faith.